The 7 most brutal execution methods of the Middle Ages. The cathedral bells chimed midnight across the sleeping city, their bronze voices carrying over cobblestone streets slick with autumn rain. But in the castle's lowest dungeon, sleep was a luxury no soul would find. Iron keys rattled against rusted locks as the executioner descended stone steps worn smooth by centuries of condemned feet. His leather boots echoed through corridors that had witnessed more screams than prayers, more blood than holy water. Behind him, torchlight danced across walls blackened by smoke and stained with substances best left unnamed. The air hung thick with the smell of fear, unwashed bodies, and something else, the metallic tang of death that clung to these depths like morning fog to a graveyard. Tomorrow would bring the crowds, the jeers, the carnival atmosphere that medieval executions always attracted. But tonight belonged to preparation, to the careful arrangement of instruments that would transform living flesh into a lesson written in agony. This wasn't justice as we understand it today. This was theater, politics, and terror wrapped in the robes of divine judgment. Medieval Europe had perfected the art of killing slowly, publicly, and with maximum psychological impact. Every scream was a sermon, every death a demonstration of power that reached far beyond the scaffold. The methods they devised weren't just about ending life, they were about controlling it, shaping it, and using its destruction to maintain an order built on fear. From the breaking wool that shattered bones like kindling to the brazen bull that cooked men alive, medieval executioners wielded death like a painter wielded brushes, creating masterpieces of horror that would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. Before we descend into these chambers of calculated cruelty, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next exploration into history's most disturbing corners. Now, steel yourself. The executioner is lighting his brazier, and the first method awaits, one that turned human bodies into broken puzzles that could never be solved. The breaking wheel. When bones became splinters, the wheel stood 10 feet tall in the town square, its wooden spokes weathered gray by countless executions. To the gathered crowd, it looked almost innocent, a simple cartwheel mounted on a pole, like something that might carry grain to market. But the dark stains between its spokes told a different story, and the iron rings bolted to its rim promised horrors that would make even hardened soldiers turn away. The breaking wheel, known in Germany as the rad and in France as the rouet, was medieval Europe's answer to those crimes deemed so heinous that simple hanging wasn't enough. Reserved for murderers, traitors, and those who dared challenge the established order, it promised a death so agonizing that its very existence served as a deterrent to anyone contemplating rebellion. The process began long before the condemned reached the wheel. Stripped naked and bound with ropes, the victim was stretched across the wheel's surface, their limbs positioned between the spokes. The executioner, often a man who had inherited his grim profession from his father, would then take up his iron-headed hammer, a tool crafted specifically for breaking human bones. The breaking followed a precise ritual, as choreographed as any religious ceremony. Starting with the ankles, the executioner would deliver calculated blows, each one designed to shatter bone without immediately killing. The crowd would count along: 1, 2, 3 as femurs snapped like dry branches and tibias splintered into fragments that pierced surrounding flesh. But the wheel's true cruelty lay not in the breaking itself, but in what came after. Once every major bone had been systematically shattered, the victim's ruined limbs were threaded through the wheel's spokes, their broken arms and legs woven around the wooden frame like some grotesque garland. Then the wheel was hoisted high on its pole, displaying the still living victim to the crowd below. Death on the wheel was rarely quick. With their bones destroyed but their vital organs intact, victims could linger for hours or even days, their broken bodies exposed to the elements while crows circled overhead. Some executioners, moved by rare mercy or bribed by desperate families, would deliver a secret blow to the chest, the coup de grace that would mercifully stop the heart. But more often, the condemned were left to die slowly, their moans growing weaker as dehydration and shock finally claimed them. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical torture. Witnesses described the sound of breaking bones as haunting, a wet crack that seemed to echo in their dreams for years afterward. Children were often brought to watch, their parents believing that witnessing such horrors would teach them to respect authority and fear the consequences of sin. The wheel's popularity peaked during the late medieval period, when public executions had evolved into elaborate spectacles that combined entertainment with intimidation. Towns competed to stage the most memorable executions, with vendors selling food and drink to crowds that treated the proceedings like a festival. The breaking wheel, with its dramatic visual impact and prolonged suffering, became the centerpiece of these grim celebrations. Records from 14th-century France describe executions where the wheel was decorated with flowers and ribbons, as if death itself were being celebrated. The condemned were sometimes forced to wear crowns of thorns or other religious symbols, their suffering deliberately echoing the crucifixion of Christ. This blasphemous theater served a dual purpose: it satisfied the crowd's appetite for spectacle while reinforcing the message that challenging authority was tantamount to challenging God himself. But the wheel's reign of terror eventually came to an end, not from mercy but from efficiency. As medieval Europe gave way to the early modern period, authorities began to favor quicker, more reliable methods of execution. The wheel required skilled executioners and could sometimes fail to kill, leaving authorities with the embarrassing problem of a still-living victim who had technically survived their sentence. Drawing and quartering, the ultimate dismemberment. If the breaking wheel was medieval Europe's instrument of bone-shattering agony, then drawing and quartering was its masterpiece of systematic dismemberment. Reserved for the crime of high treason, the ultimate betrayal of king and country, this method promised not just death, but the complete destruction of the human form, a literal tearing apart that mirrored the way the condemned had supposedly torn at the fabric of society itself. The process began with the most degrading journey imaginable. The condemned traitor was tied to a hurdle, wooden frame like a crude sledge, and dragged through the streets behind a horse. This wasn't transportation, it was the first stage of torture. Cobblestones tore at exposed flesh, while crowds pelted the victim with refuse, rotten food, and worse. By the time they reached the execution site, many were already bloodied and broken, their skins scraped raw by the rough journey. But this public humiliation was merely the prelude to horrors that would make the wheel seem merciful by comparison. At the scaffold, the real work began with a ritual that combined execution with surgical precision. The condemned was first hanged, but only until nearly dead. The rope was cut before strangulation could claim them, ensuring they remained conscious for what followed. While still alive and aware, the victim was cut down and subjected to the most intimate violation imaginable. The executioner, working with the methodical precision of a butcher, would slice open the abdomen and remove the intestines while the heart still beat. These organs were then burned before the victim's eyes, the smoke and smell of their own cooking flesh filling their nostrils as life slowly ebbed away. But even this wasn't the end. Once death finally claimed the traitor, their body became the canvas for the final act of this grisly performance. 4 horses were brought forward, ropes attached to the corpse's limbs, and the animals were driven in opposite directions. The goal was to literally tear the body apart, separating arms and legs from the torso in a display of dismemberment that would leave no doubt about the fate awaiting future traitors. The quartering itself often proved more difficult than executioners anticipated. Human joints, even in death, were remarkably strong, and horses sometimes struggled to complete their grim task. Executioners learned to make strategic cuts at joints and tendons, weakening the connections to ensure a successful dismemberment. When horses failed, they resorted to axes and saws, hacking the body apart piece by piece while crowds cheered or retched, depending on their constitution. The most famous victim of this barbaric practice was William Wallace, the Scottish rebel whose story would later inspire legends and Hollywood films. In 1305, Wallace was dragged through London streets, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still alive, and finally quartered. His head was placed on London Bridge as a warning, while his limbs were sent to different corners of Scotland, a gruesome message that rebellion would be met with the complete destruction of both body and dignity. But Wallace was far from alone. The Gunpowder Plot conspirators of 1605 met similar fates, their bodies torn apart in front of crowds that numbered in the thousands. Guy Fawkes himself, weakened by torture, fell from the scaffold and broke his neck before the full sentence could be carried out, a mercy that his co-conspirators were denied. The psychological warfare inherent in drawing and quartering extended far beyond the execution itself. The dismembered remains were displayed throughout the realm, heads mounted on spikes, limbs hung from city gates, torsos left to rot in public squares. These grisly trophies served as constant reminders of royal power, their decay marking the passage of time while their message remained eternally fresh. The practice created its own macabre economy. Professional body part displayers emerged, men who specialized in preserving and mounting human remains for maximum visual impact. They developed techniques for treating heads and limbs to slow decay, using tar and other preservatives to ensure the warnings would last for months or even years. Families of the condemned faced their own special torment. Denied the comfort of burial rites, they were forced to watch their loved ones' remains displayed like hunting trophies. Some risked their own lives to steal body parts for proper burial, while others were driven mad by the sight of decomposing relatives hanging from familiar landmarks. The method's popularity stemmed from its perfect fusion of practical execution with symbolic destruction. By literally tearing traitors apart, authorities demonstrated that betrayal would result in the complete annihilation of the self. The body, once whole and human, became a scattered collection of rotting parts, a powerful metaphor for what happened to those who challenged the natural order. The brazen bull, cooking men alive in the workshops of ancient Sicily, a bronzesmith named Paralus crafted what he believed would be his masterpiece, a hollow bull cast in gleaming bronze, so lifelike that it seemed ready to charge across any pasture. But this bull would never graze on grass or sire calves. Instead, it was designed for a purpose so diabolical that even its creator would become its first victim, cooked alive inside his own creation as a demonstration of its terrible efficiency. The brazen bull, though invented in ancient times, found new life during the medieval period as European rulers rediscovered the artistic possibilities of execution. The device was elegantly simple in concept but horrifying in practice. The bronze bull was hollow, with a door in its side that could be opened to insert a human victim. Once sealed inside, the condemned would face a death that combined the agony of being burned alive with the psychological torture of being trapped in an increasingly hot metal tomb. Fire was lit beneath the bull, and the bronze began to heat slowly, deliberately. The metal conducted heat with merciless efficiency, turning the interior into an oven that cooked its human contents with the same thoroughness used for roasting meat. But the bull's designer had added a refinement that elevated simple execution to the level of perverted artistry, a system of pipes and chambers that transformed the victim's screams into sounds resembling the bellowing of an actual bull. This acoustic engineering served multiple purposes. It provided entertainment for spectators, who could enjoy the realistic animal sounds without being disturbed by obviously human cries of agony. It also allowed executioners to maintain the fiction that they were simply operating a mechanical device rather than slowly murdering a fellow human being. The psychological distance created by this audio transformation made the process more palatable for all involved except, of course, for the person cooking inside. The heating process was deliberately gradual, designed to maximize suffering rather than achieve quick death. Victims would first feel warmth, then uncomfortable heat, then burning pain as the bronze reached temperatures that could literally cook flesh. The confined space made escape impossible and movement increasingly difficult as the metal grew too hot to touch. Many victims died from heat exhaustion and dehydration before the actual cooking process was complete. Medieval accounts describe the brazen bull as producing the most realistic animal sounds imaginable. Spectators often commented on how lifelike the bellowing seemed, how perfectly the device mimicked a real bull in distress. This realism was achieved through the genuine agony of the human being trapped inside, their death screams mechanically transformed into entertainment for the crowd. The method's popularity among medieval rulers stemmed from its combination of technological sophistication and symbolic power. The bull represented strength, virility, and royal authority, qualities that rulers wanted associated with their justice. By feeding their enemies to a bronze bull, they demonstrated their ability to harness both nature and technology in service of their will. Different regions developed variations on the basic design. Some bulls were equipped with movable parts that could crush victims before the heating began. Others featured internal spikes or blades that would wound the condemned as they thrashed about, ensuring that blood loss would hasten death and reduce the time needed for complete cooking. These refinements were marketed as merciful improvements, though their true purpose was to create more reliable and spectacular executions. The psychological impact on witnesses was profound and lasting. Unlike other execution methods that were over relatively quickly, the brazen bull created a prolonged spectacle that could last for hours. The gradual transformation from human screams to animal bellowing, the slow heating of the bronze, the eventual silence that indicated completion, all of these elements combined to create an experience that burned itself into spectators' memories. The device also served as a powerful deterrent. Potential criminals could easily imagine themselves trapped inside the heating bronze, their flesh slowly cooking while their screams were transformed into entertainment. The brazen bull didn't just kill, it promised a death so uniquely horrible that even the bravest rebels might think twice before challenging authority. But the bull's most insidious feature was how it dehumanized both victim and spectators. By transforming human death cries into animal sounds, the device made it easier for crowds to enjoy the spectacle without confronting the reality of what they were witnessing. The condemned became literally less than human, reduced to the status of livestock being prepared for consumption. Flaying, the art of skinning humans alive. The executioner's knife gleamed in the torchlight as he made the first careful incision, a thin line across the condemned man's forehead that barely broke the skin. This wasn't butchery, it was surgery performed with the precision of a master craftsman who had spent years perfecting his terrible art. Flaying, the systematic removal of human skin while the victim remained alive, demanded skills that few possessed and fewer still could stomach acquiring. The process began with meticulous preparation. The victim was secured to a table or frame, their limbs spread and bound to prevent movement that might spoil the executioner's work. The skin had to be removed in large, intact pieces, a requirement that transformed execution into a grotesque demonstration of anatomical knowledge and surgical skill. Starting at the extremities, the executioner would make shallow cuts, separating skin from underlying muscle with movements as delicate as those of a surgeon saving life rather than destroying it. The knife had to be sharp enough to slice cleanly through skin but dull enough to avoid cutting too deeply into the flesh beneath. Too much pressure would damage the hide, too little would leave ragged edges that spoiled the final product. The victim's consciousness was carefully maintained throughout the process. Flaying was useless as both punishment and deterrent if the condemned died too quickly. Executioners learned to recognize the signs of impending shock and would pause their work, allowing the victim to recover before continuing. Some used stimulants or pain-inducing substances to keep their subjects alert and responsive. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical agony. Victims could watch their own skin being peeled away, could see their body being systematically destroyed while their mind remained trapped inside increasingly exposed flesh. The sensation of air touching raw nerve endings created pain beyond description, while the sight of their own hide being carefully preserved drove many to madness before death finally claimed them. Medieval flaying served multiple purposes beyond simple execution. The removed skin was often preserved and displayed as a warning to others, sometimes tanned and turned into leather for symbolic purposes. Churches occasionally displayed the skins of executed criminals as reminders of divine justice, while secular authorities used them to decorate public buildings or create macabre trophies. The most skilled executioners could remove skin in single, intact pieces that preserved the human form even after death. These complete hides were particularly prized for display purposes, as they maintained the recognizable shape of their former owner while serving as unmistakable evidence of what awaited those who challenged authority. Different cultures developed distinct flaying techniques, each with its own ritualistic elements and symbolic meanings. Some began the process at the head, slowly working downward to preserve the victim's ability to see their own destruction. Others started at the feet, gradually ascending toward vital organs while maintaining consciousness through careful attention to blood loss and shock management. The tools of flaying were specialized instruments that required regular maintenance and expert handling. Knives had to be kept razor-sharp and perfectly clean to prevent infection that might kill the victim prematurely. Some executioners used heated blades that cauterized as they cut, reducing bleeding and extending the victim's survival time. The duration of a flaying execution could vary dramatically depending on the executioner's skill and the victim's constitution. Expert practitioners could keep subjects alive for hours, methodically removing skin while monitoring vital signs and adjusting their technique to prevent premature death. Less skilled executioners might accidentally sever major blood vessels, ending the process before achieving maximum psychological impact. The method's effectiveness as a deterrent stemmed from its combination of extreme physical pain with psychological horror. Potential criminals could easily imagine the sensation of having their skin slowly peeled away, the agony of exposed nerves, the horror of watching their own body being systematically destroyed. The preserved skins displayed throughout medieval cities served as constant reminders of this fate. But flaying also served more subtle purposes in medieval society. It represented the ultimate violation of bodily integrity, the complete stripping away of the barrier between self and world. In cultures that viewed the body as the temple of the soul, flaying was tantamount to spiritual destruction, a way of damning the victim not just in life but in whatever afterlife awaited them. Sawing, the slow descent into death. The great saw hung suspended between two wooden posts, its teeth gleaming with an oil that kept them sharp and ready for their grisly work. Below, the condemned hung upside down, blood pooling in their head while gravity ensured they would remain conscious far longer than nature ever intended. This was sawing, perhaps the most methodical and prolonged of all medieval execution methods, a technique that transformed the simple act of cutting wood into a horror that could last for hours. The inversion was crucial to the method's effectiveness. By hanging the victim upside down, executioners ensured that blood would flow to the brain, maintaining consciousness even as the saw slowly bisected the body from groin toward head. What should have been a mercifully quick death became an agonizing journey through anatomical layers, each cut revealing new structures while the victim remained horrifyingly aware of their own dissection. The sawing began at the most intimate point of the human anatomy, a deliberate choice that added sexual humiliation to physical agony. The executioners worked slowly, deliberately, their rhythm as steady as woodcutters felling a tree. But unlike wood, human flesh fought back, muscles contracted, organs shifted, and blood flowed in ways that complicated the cutting process and prolonged the victim's suffering. The saw's teeth were designed for this specific purpose, their size and spacing calculated to cut through human tissue efficiently while avoiding the quick death that might result from severing major arteries too early. The goal was to maintain life as long as possible, to ensure that the condemned remained conscious to experience every moment of their systematic dismemberment. Medieval accounts describe victims remaining conscious and able to speak even after the saw had cut through their pelvis and into their abdomen. The inverted position, combined with the body's remarkable ability to compensate for trauma, could keep the brain functioning even as internal organs were exposed and damaged. Some victims reportedly lived until the saw reached their diaphragm or heart, a journey that could take hours to complete. The psychological impact on both victim and spectators was profound. Unlike other execution methods that relied on external forces, fire, crushing, or dismemberment by animal sawing made human agency unmistakably clear. The executioner's deliberate, methodical movements, the steady rhythm of the cutting, the gradual progress through anatomical layers, all of these elements emphasized that this was not natural death but calculated human cruelty. The method's popularity in certain regions stemmed from its perfect combination of prolonged suffering with symbolic meaning. The saw represented industry, craftsmanship, and the transformation of raw materials into useful products. By applying this tool to human bodies, authorities demonstrated their power to reduce even the most rebellious subjects to their component parts. Different variations of sawing developed in different regions, each with its own refinements and cultural significance. Some executioners used heated saws that cauterized as they cut, reducing blood loss and extending the victim's survival time. Others employed serrated blades with specially designed teeth that would catch and tear flesh rather than cutting cleanly through it. The positioning of spectators was carefully choreographed to maximize the method's psychological impact. Crowds were arranged so that they could clearly see the saw's progress, watching as it slowly revealed the victim's internal anatomy. This educational aspect was often emphasized by authorities, who claimed that witnessing such executions provided valuable lessons about human anatomy and divine justice. The duration of sawing executions made them particularly effective as public spectacles. Unlike hangings or beheadings that were over in minutes, sawing provided hours of entertainment for crowds that treated executions as social events. Vendors sold food and drink, families brought children for educational purposes, and the entire community gathered to witness the slow destruction of those who had violated social norms. The method also served important political purposes. By demonstrating their willingness to inflict such prolonged and intimate torture, rulers sent clear messages about the consequences of rebellion or betrayal. The saw's slow progress through the victim's body paralleled the gradual but inevitable reach of royal justice, patient, methodical, and ultimately inescapable. But sawing's most insidious feature was how it transformed the human body into a public anatomy lesson. As the saw progressed, spectators could observe the arrangement of organs, the structure of bones, the flow of blood through vessels. This educational aspect helped justify the cruelty by framing it as a contribution to medical knowledge and public understanding of human anatomy. Boiling, death by degrees. The great cauldron sat over a carefully tended fire, its iron sides already warm to the touch as servants added bucket after bucket of water. Steam began to rise as the temperature climbed, and the condemned could only watch in growing horror as their death was prepared with the same care a cook might use for preparing a feast. Boiling alive was medieval Europe's answer to those crimes that demanded not just death, but a slow, agonizing dissolution that would serve as the ultimate deterrent to others. The method's apparent simplicity masked a sophisticated understanding of human physiology and pain tolerance. The water's temperature was carefully controlled hot enough to cause excruciating pain and eventual death, but not so hot that the victim would die quickly from shock. This delicate balance required experienced executioners who understood exactly how much heat the human body could endure while remaining conscious. The process began with the victim being lowered slowly into the warming water, often feet first, to prolong the agony. As the temperature rose, the condemned would experience a progression of sensations that began with discomfort and escalated to unbearable pain. The gradual heating allowed the body to adjust partially to each new level of heat, preventing the quick death that might result from sudden immersion in boiling water. The psychological torture was as carefully orchestrated as the physical suffering. Victims could see the steam rising around them, could feel the water growing hotter by degrees, could anticipate each new level of agony before it arrived. This foreknowledge transformed the execution into a prolonged mental torture that began long before the water reached lethal temperatures. Medieval accounts describe the various stages of boiling with clinical precision. First came the reddening of the skin as blood vessels dilated in response to heat. Then blistering as the outer layers of skin began to cook. The victims' movements became increasingly frantic as pain intensified, their struggles sending waves across the water's surface that entertained spectators while hastening their own demise. The method was particularly favored for certain types of crimes, especially those involving poison or other forms of treachery that were seen as particularly cowardly or underhanded. The symbolism was clear: those who had used heat and chemistry to harm others would themselves be destroyed by the same forces, their bodies literally cooked like the meals they had poisoned. Different regions developed variations on the basic boiling technique, each designed to maximize suffering while serving specific symbolic purposes. Some executioners added oil to the water, creating a mixture that would adhere to the victim's skin and continue burning even above the waterline. Others used wine or other liquids that carried cultural significance, transforming the execution into a perverted religious or social ritual. The timing of boiling executions was often coordinated with market days or religious festivals, ensuring maximum attendance and impact. The slow nature of the process made it ideal for public spectacles, providing hours of entertainment while serving as an extended lesson about the consequences of challenging authority. The cauldrons themselves became objects of both fascination and terror in medieval communities. Often permanently installed in public squares, they served as constant reminders of the fate awaiting criminals. Children would dare each other to touch the iron sides, while adults would point them out to misbehaving offspring as warnings about the consequences of sin and disobedience. The method's effectiveness as a deterrent stemmed from its combination of extreme pain with symbolic meaning. The transformation of the human body from solid flesh to cooked meat was a powerful metaphor for the complete destruction that awaited those who violated social norms. The victim's gradual dissolution in the boiling water paralleled their moral and social dissolution through their crimes. But boiling also served more practical purposes in medieval justice systems. The method was relatively inexpensive, requiring only a cauldron, fuel, and water resources available in any community. It could be performed by relatively unskilled executioners, unlike more complex methods that required specialized knowledge or equipment. The duration of boiling executions varied depending on the water temperature and the victim's constitution. Strong individuals might survive for an hour or more, their agony prolonged by their own physical resilience. Weaker victims might succumb more quickly, though executioners learned to adjust temperatures to ensure that even the frail would suffer appropriately before death claimed them. Impalement. The slow skewer. The stake stood 12 feet tall in the castle courtyard, its wooden point sharpened to a perfect cone that gleamed with oil applied to ease its passage through human flesh. This wasn't the quick impalement of battlefield warfare, where spears and pikes ended lives in moments. This was judicial impalement, a methodical process designed to thread a human body onto a wooden spike while keeping the victim alive for as long as possible, sometimes for days. The technique required extraordinary skill and anatomical knowledge. The executioner had to guide the stake through the victim's body in such a way that it avoided major organs and blood vessels, threading between vital structures like a needle through fabric. The goal was to create a living scarecrow, a human being suspended on a pole who would serve as a warning to others while enduring unimaginable agony. The process began with careful positioning. The victim was placed over the stake's point, usually at the base of the torso, and then slowly lowered onto the sharpened wood. The executioner would guide the stake's progress, using his knowledge of human anatomy to ensure it followed a path that would maximize suffering while minimizing the risk of quick death. The stake's journey through the human body was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. It would pierce internal organs without destroying them completely, push aside blood vessels without severing them, and gradually work its way upward through the torso toward the head or neck. The victim remained conscious throughout this internal violation, feeling every inch of wood as it slowly penetrated deeper into their body. The most skilled executioners could thread a stake completely through a human body without causing immediate death. The wooden point might emerge from the victim's mouth, shoulder, or neck, creating a grotesque display that served as the ultimate deterrent to potential criminals. The impaled victim would hang suspended on the stake, still alive but slowly dying as their body's systems gradually failed. The duration of survival on the stake varied dramatically depending on the executioner's skill and the victim's constitution. Some died within hours from shock or internal bleeding. Others lingered for days, their bodies slowly shutting down as the wooden invader disrupted normal physiological functions. The longest recorded survival was reportedly over a week, though such claims may be exaggerated by chroniclers seeking to emphasize the method's horror. The psychological impact of impalement was perhaps its most effective feature. The sight of a human being suspended on a stake, still moving and sometimes still speaking, created an image that burned itself into witnesses' memories. The victim's gradual deterioration, their weakening voice, their increasingly labored breathing, their eventual silence provided a prolonged lesson about the consequences of defying authority. Impalement served multiple symbolic purposes in medieval society. The stake represented the phallus, making the method particularly appropriate for sexual crimes or challenges to masculine authority. The vertical positioning elevated the victim above the crowd, creating a perverted parody of religious crucifixion that emphasized the condemned separation from divine grace. Different cultures developed distinct impalement techniques, each with its own refinements and cultural significance. Some used stakes with specially designed points that would spread apart inside the body, making removal impossible and ensuring that any attempt at rescue would only increase the victim's suffering. Others employed stakes with rough surfaces that would tear flesh as the body settled onto the wood. The positioning of impaled victims was carefully chosen for maximum visual impact. Stakes were often erected along major roads, at city gates, or in public squares where they would be seen by the largest number of people. The gradual decay of the impaled body served as a long-term reminder of royal justice, the victim's slow transformation from living person to skeleton marking the passage of time while the warning remained fresh. The method's popularity among certain rulers stemmed from its perfect combination of extreme cruelty with symbolic power. Vlad the Impaler, the historical figure who inspired Dracula legends, reportedly impaled thousands of victims, creating forests of stakes that served as both military deterrent and psychological warfare. His reputation for impalement became so notorious that enemies would sometimes surrender rather than risk such a fate. But impalement also served practical purposes in medieval warfare and justice. The method required minimal resources, just a sharpened stake and the knowledge to use it effectively. It could be performed quickly in battlefield conditions or elaborately in judicial settings, making it adaptable to various circumstances and purposes. The technique's effectiveness as a deterrent stemmed from its combination of extreme pain with prolonged visibility. Unlike other execution methods that ended relatively quickly, impalement created a lasting display that could serve as a warning for weeks or even months. The victim's slow death provided an extended lesson about the consequences of challenging authority, while their eventual decay reminded viewers of mortality's inevitability. As we emerge from these chambers of medieval cruelty, our minds reeling from the systematic horrors we've witnessed, we must confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature. These weren't the inventions of monsters or madmen, but the carefully crafted tools of civilized societies that saw torture and execution as necessary elements of justice and social control. The breaking will that shattered bones like kindling, the brazen bull that cooked men while transforming their screams into entertainment, the methodical sawing that turned human bodies into anatomical lessons, all of these methods were created by people who attended church, loved their families, and considered themselves moral and righteous. They weren't aberrations but expressions of a worldview that saw extreme cruelty as not just acceptable but virtuous when applied to the right targets. The crowds that gathered to watch these executions weren't bloodthirsty savages but ordinary citizens seeking entertainment, education, and social connection. They brought their children to learn about justice, their neighbors to share in community experiences, their own fears and prejudices to be validated by the suffering of others. The executioners themselves were often respected craftsmen, their skills passed down through generations like any other trade. What makes these medieval methods so disturbing isn't just their cruelty, but their sophistication. The careful attention to anatomy that kept victims alive longer, the psychological manipulation that maximized terror, the symbolic elements that transformed simple killing into complex social theater, all of these features reveal minds that were intelligent, creative, and utterly convinced of their own righteousness. The legacy of medieval execution methods extends far beyond their historical period. The techniques developed in castle dungeons and public squares influenced legal systems, social structures, and cultural attitudes for centuries to come. The idea that extreme pain could serve justice, that public suffering could deter crime, that the state had the right to destroy human bodies in pursuit of social order, these concepts shaped civilization in ways we're still grappling with today. But perhaps the most important lesson from these dark chapters of human history is the reminder that cruelty is always a choice. The medieval world wasn't inherently more violent than our own, it simply made different choices about how to channel and express the capacity for violence that exists in every human heart. The same intelligence that created cathedrals and universities also designed breaking wheels and brazen bulls, proving that civilization and barbarism can coexist in the same minds, the same societies, the same historical moments. The victims of these brutal methods were real people with names, families, hopes, and fears that were systematically destroyed by their tormentors. Their suffering wasn't abstract or theoretical but immediate and personal, their pain as real as anything we might experience today. They died not for justice but for spectacle, not for truth but for terror, not for the good of society but for the satisfaction of those who held power over them. Today, as we walk through medieval castles or read about historical justice systems, we should remember that the stones beneath our feet are stained with more than just time. The dungeons we tour as tourists once echoed with screams that were as real as our own voices. The instruments we view in museums once tore flesh that was as sensitive as our own skin. So tell us, which of these 7 brutal methods do you find most disturbing? The systematic bone-breaking of the wheel, the prolonged cooking of the brazen bull, the intimate violation of flaying, or perhaps the methodical precision of sawing? What does their existence tell us about the societies that created and used them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this journey into medieval Europe's darkest corners has opened your eyes to the depths of historical cruelty, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next exploration into the shadows of the past. Remember, the stories we tell on Scandalous Pasts are fictional narratives that may be inspired by real historical events, but are not presented as historical fact. Until next time, remember that the true measure of any civilization isn't found in its monuments or achievements, but in how it treats those who are powerless to defend themselves. The medieval world failed that test catastrophically, and their methods of execution stand as permanent reminders of what happens when power is given free rein to express itself through cruelty. The castle walls may be silent now, but the lessons they teach us about human nature echo through the centuries, warning us that the capacity for such systematic cruelty lies dormant in every society, waiting for the right combination of fear, power, and moral justification to awaken it once again.